Good morning, everyone. I'm James Jeffrey, the chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Institute. Today's Building a Better Lebanon initiative is organized in cooperation with knowledge partners that include the Atlantic Council, the Wilson Center, and the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. The project is sponsored by Beirut-based Al-Iqtisad wal Amal, which is the Arab region's leading business communications group. I would also like to welcome as our keynote speaker today my longtime Foreign Service colleague and former U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon, David Hale. The World Bank's spring 2021 issue of Lebanon Economic Monitor warns that the crisis which the country is facing is, quote, likely to rank in the top 10, possibly the top 3 most severe crises globally since the mid-19th century. The report notes that Lebanon's gross national product fell from approximately 55 billion in 2018 to an estimated 33 billion in 2020. The dire economic situation will take decades to repair, with more than 55% of the population already in poverty, an unemployment rate of 40%. The workforce ratio of women is a disastrously low 23%. In this report, the co-authors explore the best ways out of this crisis. The Building a Better Lebanon authors argue that any reform program should be simple, transparent, and most importantly, managed by credible government of reform. Advocating a combination of measures, they highlight immediate steps needed. The report builds on a series of workshops hosted by the Wilson Center and Atlantic Council with experts from and on Lebanon. Let's look at the larger geographic picture for a moment, please. The international system has interests that justify emergency economic assistance to Lebanon. First, to prevent creation of a failed state. Second, to keep Lebanon from the larger conflicts in the vicinity. Third, to support more than 2 million Palestinian and Syrian refugees. Fourth, to undergird Lebanon's magnificent experiment in cross-ethnic and cross-religious communal life. Finally, to avoid its subjugation to any outside power. There is currently a general international consensus linking serious economic support for Lebanon with major reforms to attain effective governance, root out corruption, maintain capable nonpartisan armed forces, and undertake economic recovery and rebuilding. Longer term, the international community expects Lebanon to conduct elections in the spring of 2022. I will now turn the program over to Ambassador Giampiero Massolo, President of the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, to provide an overview of the European perspective. Ambassador Massolo is a career diplomat, most recently served as coordinator of the Italian intelligence community, and is also an adjunct professor both at the School of Government of the LUISS University in Rome and at Sciences Po, Paris School of International Affairs. Ambassador Massolo, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jeffrey. Please let me say how pleased and honored I am to be in this broad conference about building better Lebanon, and how much we at ISP enjoyed cooperating with Wilson Center and the Atlantic Council. And I also want to greet Ambassador Hale and to thank him for having accepted to be our keynote speaker today. And also thank you very much to our panelists. By the way, 3 of them, Rand Gayat, Hoop Tran, and Melissa Kurma, are co-authors of the report. So thank you all very much. Of course, Lebanon is a systemic crisis. It is a crisis that has both bilateral and national consequences and national risks, and presents also major risks from the systemic point of view for the region itself. I would even dare to say for the international community as such. It's actually a multi-layer crisis. It's political crisis, economic, financial, humanitarian, cultural, and as usual, unfortunately, in the region, many external spoilers and people that are interested to the instability of Lebanon are not helping from outside. And there is also a third layer here, a layer that involves broader powers as the United States, as Russia, I would say, China, with its penetration in the region, which we need to contain. And I would say, of course, European Union. European Union, let's be frank, it's not exactly a master in handling regional political crises. There is still sort of a lack of identity for European Union on the international arena, and Lebanon is no exception for this. Not necessarily the European member countries represent a united front. But my hope, and it is not just a hope, it is also based on an increased and what I see as an enhanced way of cooperating among the European countries together. Maybe Lebanon can offer a platform, a basis, in order to relaunch something like a meaningful way for the European Union to intervene in his near neighborhood and to assume duties and responsibilities that are really up for Europe and for the individual member states to take upon themselves. Actually, as think tanks, we are in charge of providing perspectives and try to act as catalyzers for governments. And this is actually what we are trying to do at ESP, partnering with the Atlantic Council and with the Wilson Center. And I'm also offering here our joint endeavor in order to be able to take the opportunity of the incoming Med Dialogue Conference, which we are organizing together with the Italian government for early December, in order to offer an idea and platform to engage the participation of important leaders, experts, and trying to keep high our commitments. And to do this, I am convinced that the recommendations that are coming out from our joint report can serve as a good basis in order for our work to progress. Thank you once again to all of you. Please, I am now switched to Ambassador Hale for his keynote remarks, please.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. And it's great to see so many friends that have joined us, and particular thanks to Jim Jeffrey and Marissa Horma from the Wilson Center, and Hadley. I look forward to our conversation. Just to start with one point, I'm still an employee of the State Department, and I'm on detail at the Wilson Center. So I do want to say that my comments today are not on behalf of the US government or the State Department, but just based on my own observations. I've been in and out of Lebanon since 1988 and have lived there for a total of 8 years, spread over that period of time. It's been a big part of my life. Most recently, I was there just as Ramadan began. And I have to say, I've not seen in all these years the level of despair since the end of the tragic civil war, in fact. I met with many Lebanese leaders across the board to discuss the prolonged political gridlock and the deteriorating economic conditions. I have to say, few shared the sense of urgency that they should have. I called for greater flexibility by those leaders to overcome the cabinet impasse that is impeding economic reform. And unfortunately, I've not seen such flexibility in the last 2 months or so, nor did I after I visited in August 2020 in the wake of the port explosion, nor after December 2019 when I visited as the current state of paralysis set in. Lebanon is precarious even at the best of times. Its structure of governance makes it hard to get things done by design, so that no community feels dominated. Historically, governments do very little, while a sort of economic free-for-all produces winners and losers. I think the protests of the past decade have had a lot to do with a public sense that there are way too many winners and far too few losers, and that those winning do so by virtue of graft and corruption and access to public funds. The Lebanese people are suffering the consequences of their failure the leaders' failure to meet their responsibility to put the country's interests first. People have lost their life savings, access to basic health care, and even the ability to feed their families. The housing crisis arising from the port explosion remains acute. Lebanese popular demands are also well known. Transparency, accountability, an end to the endemic corruption and mismanagement. And meeting these demands will put Lebanon at least a little bit down the road to fulfilling its incredible potential. And the report being presented today provides a wealth of expertise and proposals on how to do so. But little will happen without the necessary political will. The US and others have long called for Lebanon's leaders to show sufficient flexibility and form a government that's willing and capable of reversing the collapse underway. The time to build a government, not block it, is upon us, and the time for comprehensive reform is now. We in America are ready to help, but can't without a Lebanese partner. One bright spot is the possibility that Lebanon may have offshore gas. During my visit, there was some hope that we could move forward with US-facilitated talks with Israel on this matter under a UN umbrella. I hope that remains the case, and Lebanon's leaders will refrain from allowing their own competition to block progress that could benefit people on both sides of the border. Which brings me to Hezbollah. Lebanon will never regain its strength or achieve true sovereignty so long as one faction can accumulate dangerous weapons and undertake smuggling and other illicit and corrupt activities. No state can live up to that name of being a state so long as one faction, answering only to a foreign capital, can make life and death decisions for all the state's citizens. Yet that is the situation in Lebanon today. In contrast to Iranian arming of a faction, of a militia, the US has been helping to boost the capabilities of the Lebanese army for years, benefiting all Lebanese. Lebanon's true friends around should help strengthen the state and not one faction. I'm asked often about the link between Lebanon and the talks in Vienna on restoring compliance with JCPOA. Those talks are focused on JCPOA, not on the region. But the truth is, if we want a vibrant and peaceful Lebanon, we will have to address all elements of Iran's destabilizing behavior in the region, including in Lebanon. We will defend our interests and support our friends in Lebanon. And I believe that view is shared in Washington on a bipartisan basis. American policy in this regard is firm. So there is no reason for anyone in Lebanon to adopt a wait and see attitude. America's core interests do not shift year to year or administration to administration. There has been strong bipartisan support for our approach to Lebanon. But to succeed, Lebanese leaders have to do their part to undertake necessary reforms to salvage the socioeconomic situation and access the international financial resources that can help restore Lebanese faith in their future. Once they make that decision, once they show that political will, I think the report and the discussion we have today will help inform the tangible steps needed in order to fulfill those wishes. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion and hearing more from the experts. Over.
Hadley, you're on mute. Excellent. Hope everyone can hear me now. Thank you so much, Ambassador Hale. Once again, I'm Hadley Gamble. I'm CNBC's senior international correspondent and anchor in the region. And it's a thrill, as always, to be talking about a subject that's very close to my heart, and I know close to the hearts of all of you involved in this incredible report for building a better Lebanon. Hopefully, we can frankly sustain the challenges of today and tomorrow. Ambassador Hale, thank you so much for those remarks. I want to just get right into it with you at this point. You were just discussing America's interests, obviously, in Lebanon and in the region more broadly. And obviously, you are not speaking directly for the government. I want to reiterate that as well. But when you think about this within the context of your knowledge of this part of the world, what leverage do you believe that the United States actually has today with regards to Iran and via Iran, Hezbollah, when it comes to influencing what happens in Lebanon, if the Biden administration is, as is
recording in progress,
intent on getting a deal with regards to a new JCPOA? What's the leverage that the United States has at this point?
Well, we'll see once a deal is made what the ingredients are that we have to work with. But there are a whole
because there's a sense that we're giving it all away if we open up the, if you will, with the central bank, with allowing Iran once again to be part of the international financial system.
Well, there are a stack of other sanctions in place that are there because of Iran's behavior in the region and because of their human rights violations, because of their terrorist activity. I don't have which sanctions apply to which cases, but Iran will continue to be constrained by those sanctions until they address those concerns of ours. I think we also need to show unity of purpose and show that there's an alliance in the region of those who reject Iranians' behavior and to stand together and call out Iran's actions when they occur. So the reputational issue as well, I think, is important. So those will be the two main tools that we have. And I think it's very important that we continue to speak out and to make sure that no one forgets what Hezbollah and other proxies of Iran are doing.
Who do you consider to be the real main partners of the United States in this, other than the EU? Because at this point, when I speak to leaders specifically in the Gulf countries, and I'm talking about the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, they have a very, very hands-off approach to what happens in Lebanon. They seem to have given it up as a loss in that sense. Well,
it is true that some of the senior Gulf officials have been very frustrated, as we all have been, by the situation that I described in Ambassador Masolo. But I noticed today that the Saudi foreign minister joined the French foreign minister and Secretary Blinken in a meeting on Lebanon, or at least partially on Lebanon, and there was a statement on Lebanon. So there may be a renewed recognition that however frustrating the situation may be in Lebanon, all of us have interests there. And we know from the historical perspective, if you look back over time, past crises, neglect of Lebanon will not make Lebanon better. So we need to find ways without throwing away our resources to make sure that Lebanon is put on a more stable footing.
In terms of that stable footing, what's the greatest danger there in your view?
Well, there's an immediate catastrophe upon us, which is the financial situation, the Ponzi scheme that essentially the banks and the government and leading business entities have been involved in has gone on for decades, but it's reached a point now where a collapse is imminent. And I think the report addresses that, has some ideas. The most urgent thing to do is to stabilize the financial picture and then embark on the other reforms that are needed. But, you know, economics and finance go hand in hand with politics and security. And so again, we have to make sure that there's a government that not only has the political will, but the means to accomplish these reforms. And secondly, that we continue to provide our assistance to the legitimate institution that is meant to defend Lebanon and secure Lebanon, and that's the army, in contrast to Iran's strategy.
Ambassador, you talked about a Ponzi scheme. What does it, or what is it meant to say to people in Lebanon when US officials, yourself included, continue to meet with the central bank governor, Riyad Salemi, who was actually under investigation in Switzerland and elsewhere for activities that supposedly have been ripping off the Lebanese people? A lot of Lebanese don't consider him to be someone who is someone worth actually speaking to. They consider him part of the problem. You refer to it as a Ponzi scheme. Should American officials still be meeting with him?
Well, he's the governor of the central bank, and he's crucial for finding a way forward.
Do you believe he was part of the problem in terms of that Ponzi scheme?
I would not blame any one individual. I've not seen any evidence. Obviously, if there's investigations underway, they will uncover what there is, if anything, to uncover. I'm not here to defend or do otherwise of an individual, but we meet with everybody in Lebanon except terrorists. It is a country where if you cut yourself off as a diplomat, foreign government from any of the elements that have say-so in Lebanon, you're doing yourself a disservice. So we'll continue to talk to him and to others to try to make sure that the right things are done to put Lebanon back on a path towards stability.
I understand what you're saying, but isn't that a form of financial terrorism to destroy a country's?
The decisions were made by governments, and they were operating based on whatever inputs they felt were important at the moment. You know, I remember vividly, I wrote a telegram in 1992. I was a political economic officer in Beirut, where I wrote extensively on this problem. And I said, this is going to collapse any moment. Of course, that was 1992, and here we are. It continued for quite a while. There are a lot of people who've been involved over time and bear some responsibility for this situation. That's why it's so acute, as it has taken so long. It has dug so deeply into the institutions.
We think about the political pressure or the political will that needs to be considered in order for anything to move forward in Lebanon today. Apparently the IMF today informed the caretaker finance minister that they might consider allocating as much as 900 million to Lebanon come August. That was just to boost the foreign currency reserves of the central bank. The problem, of course, for Lebanese folks, much more immediate. And of course, all of this against the backdrop of what we've seen coming out of this coronavirus pandemic globally. When you think about this with regards to the US government specifically, what can the US government or what can the Lebanese people hope for from the US government specifically in terms of trying to get back on their feet, at least in the short term? Because we can talk about building a better Lebanon as much as we want. The door has to be open, doesn't it?
It does, but the key to opening the door is in the hands of Lebanese leaders. They have to demonstrate to us that they have the will and the capacity to take the reforms needed so that any international financing will not be wasted as it has been in the past. There's not going to be any international bailout. There will be substantial assistance for a reform program that's going to be painful. And I hope today there's some talk about that because the Lebanese people have had enough. And particularly people on the lower end of the economic spectrum, lower income people just are living hand to mouth. And so there has to be found a way to not just impose the tough reforms, but make sure that people can survive. If we see strategies from the Lebanese that demonstrate that, and again, I'm not speaking for the government anymore, but I was up till 2 months ago, and our lines have always been, you will see generosity from the international institutions, financial institutions where the US has a large vote. And meanwhile, we'll also see what we can do independently, particularly on the humanitarian front to help soften what will inevitably be some of the pain from the reform.
When I would speak to US officials over the last 4 to 8 years, there just wasn't that much appetite, frankly, for Lebanon. And when I would speak to Trump officials, for example, they would tell me if the top 10 things are on the list, Lebanon is 12, 14, or 15 on down. What do you think that the Lebanese can at least count on from the US in the short term? You talked about support of the Lebanese army, but at the same point right now, they're not able to feed their people. They're not able to pay their people. What can we expect in the short term, do you think, from the US government, even as just a stopgap measure?
Yeah, it's true that Lebanon doesn't always rise to the high priority. But again, I've always made the point that don't wait for the crises because then you're dealing with an even worse situation. So we need to tend this situation at all times. And in addition to whatever direct bilateral assistance we provide, which is in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually, we are an advocate for Lebanon with others. And so, for example, we give substantial assistance to the Lebanese army, but we can't pay their salaries. Well, others can. And so we've talked to the EU. Ambassador Solo can address that. We've talked to the government of France about it. And these are the discussions that Secretary Blinken has been having. It came up in the bilateral meeting with the French foreign minister. It came up at the G7 meeting with the French. So it is discussed. But I think people should look to the United States as being able to sort of amplify our own assistance by encouraging others to be generous, again, on condition that the reforms are really and truly being made, not just a bailout.
How do you respond to those who say that the Lebanese people are being held hostage by their own ineffectual and corrupt political leaders, that there is no way around it?
Well, there has to be found a way around it. I mean, it's certainly true that the people are suffering from the behavior of their leaders, and I will not defend that at all. I criticize it every time I have a chance to speak about Lebanon, but we can't just abandon that, Lebanese to that situation. But then again, we've got to put the pressure on Lebanese leaders to make the right decisions. We can't do that for them. They can't wait for outsiders to come and fix the political problems, which has been a pattern in the past. And so they inevitably expect that at some point others will come in. I do not see that on the horizon. They're going to have to resolve the political differences sufficiently to get the reforms underway.
Ambassador, there's an argument to be made, or that some have been making, that essentially with years of the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, and then with the simultaneous destruction of the Lebanese economy, that opened the door for, frankly, Hezbollah to become a full steam ahead in terms of money laundering. At this point, the black market for dollars is such that they're able to fund themselves. do you believe that within that context, U.S. maximum pressure was a failure? Because essentially, no.
I would phrase it. I'd phrase the whole issue slightly differently, if I may, Hadley. Hezbollah has been doing that for decades. They're getting better and better at it, but they have been.
Well, they're certainly much better at it with a failed state in terms of the economy.
They do not suffer as much as the others do, but they have vast sources of income. They get money from their followers around the world. They do illicit activities, as you said, inside Lebanon, and they get a huge cash infusion from the Iranians, which never stopped. So they had the resources they needed before JCPOA. They had the resources they needed during JCPOA. They had the resources they needed during maximum pressure. And they will have resources after, if there is a JCPOA, returns to compliance. But the point I'm making is we should not accept that. But we should be clear that it is an incredibly resilient organization. So we need smart strategies in order to deal with it. And I don't think that we have yet, frankly, found that. We need to think harder about what we're going to do. Now, maximum pressure might have worked if we had, if more time had been allowed for it. We don't know. More JCPOA might have worked if we'd allowed more time for that. We don't know. These are all imponderables. All I know is I see a steady trajectory, regardless of the regional environment, where Hezbollah just gets stronger and stronger, and we've got to stop that.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your remarks. It's wonderful to have you. Thank you again. I want to get now to the actual report and the author of that report, Building a Better Lebanon. Ron Gaida is the adjunct professor from Harvard University. Marissa Kerma, of course, director, Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Hung Tran is a non-resident senior fellow for the Atlantic Council. And as a commentator as well on this report, Mohsen Khan, he's non-resident senior fellow for the Atlantic Council. He's also the former director for the Middle East and Central Asia, the IMF. It's wonderful to have you all join us, and thank you again so much for your work on this report. I do want to kick it off with Ron, however, and just to get to the initial question, really. I mean, we kind of all know how we got here, but if you'd like to just give us a brief overview of where we are at this moment and how potentially we could move forward in the coming days. As the ambassadors mentioned, we have elections supposedly coming up in the spring of 2022. There seems to be some movement, at least within government at this point. Rand, take it away.
Thank you, Hadley. I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you. And I want to thank the ambassadors for the time they've put into this. Look, I think at this point, everybody has a very good understanding of the reasons why Lebanon ended up here in the first place. This is obviously a crisis that has been in the making for many, many years. I tend to disagree a little bit with Ambassador Hale. I think Riyad Salami is a key part of this crisis. Unfortunately, we're now no longer in an economic crisis. It has turned into a humanitarian crisis. You've got mass poverty, you've got mass unemployment, and you've got a new wave of immigration by the very same people that the country needs today to rebuild the economy. So, I mean, the good news is in Lebanon and in the diaspora, you've got an enormous amount of human capital. And we've been seeing a lot of different initiatives over the past year, although views continue to differ on what should be done to address the crisis. So just very briefly, you've got a camp now that is calling for a new economic model focused primarily on agriculture. On the other hand, you've got another camp calling for a comprehensive, full-fledged structural and fiscal adjustment program, of course, with the under the umbrella of the IMF, with a very long list of front-loaded reforms. And you know, in an ideal world, you'd want to see all these reforms happening at the same time. But experience from other countries, and especially fragile states like Lebanon with very weak cohesiveness, very weak institutions, have actually shown that it's very difficult to actually adhere and to stick to a program that is very intense like this. I mean, I myself, and I know that my colleagues here on the panel have all worked on IMF programs and have all seen programs that went off track because it was very demanding. So the bottom line, it's not really a shortage of economic ideas. It's mainly what is lacking today is a pragmatic and reliable roadmap for implementation, for implementing all these ideas in a way that you don't really threaten the stability in the country. You've got a very fragile state. And My three very brief points on here, and basically, I mean, let me make it clear what needs to be done, and then we can talk more about the specific. But the very first step here is we need a government. There is no way we can move forward without a government, and not just any government just for the sake of forming a government. We need a credible government of reform, a government that owns what it says it wants to do. We need a government that's very well represented by the private sector. These are basically the people who will be creating the jobs. And you cannot really bypass the government. We've seen a couple of initiatives talking about reform, plans directly with the private sector. Unfortunately, if we want to go to the international community, IMF, World Bank, and others, their bylaws would not allow us to bypass the government. So that's the first key point. The second most important point, and that has to do basically with the multilateral corporations. And specifically here, I'm referring to the IMF. Look, I mean, there is no doubt that the IMF's blessing is going to be extremely important. The IMF is going to be key in any future program for Lebanon. But in my view, that this narrative today, that a comprehensive IMF program with so many different reforms is actually a bit premature. It's going to be very difficult to negotiate. And in fact, IMF financial resources aren't really very important. What is important is the financial resources that's going to come from donor countries, from bilateral countries, from the diaspora. So before we even talk about an IMF program, what Lebanon needs to do is to, first of all, re-engage with the international community. You cannot cut yourself off the world, as Ambassador Hale said. You cannot cut yourself off the world of the Gulf region, of all your friends, and then go ask for an IMF program. And that gets me to my last point, and I'll make it very brief. What type of program we need to do, we need to basically think about today. So given what we all discussed, given the fragility of the state institution, given weak cohesiveness, a very long history of sectarian conflicts, political instability in Lebanon, I think any program that is radical, that is dramatic, is not only going to be counterproductive, but may actually end up undermining the entire reform process. So Lebanon really needs, sadly, a very simple, transparent program focused in the immediate term on what I call the low-hanging fruit. And these are basically initiatives that would deliver just very quick, tangible, and wide-ranging benefits for everybody in the economy. And this will help, gradually build confidence so that all stakeholders in the economy can actually buy into a longer-term process of reform. So I'll leave it here and turn back to you, and we'll talk more about it later.
Rand, before I let you go on that one, I just want to follow up on the one key point there. You mentioned, of course, obviously the business owners, the community of folks who would do all of the employing that Lebanon really, really needs. And you also mentioned the Lebanese diaspora. I spend a great deal of time speaking to the Lebanese diaspora across a wide range of means, if you will, from the multi-billionaires to just the folks eking out a living now here in the UAE, for example, because they've been forced to move. When you think about that a bit more broadly, how do you gain the confidence of those folks with such a corrupt state at this point? How is that possible? Not just to gain the trust, again, of the Lebanese diaspora, to put their money, to put their time, and to start businesses in Lebanon, but also, of course, governments, because they don't trust the people that they're talking to.
Well, first of all, you need to give them the opportunity to decide on the future of the country. So that's why when I go back to the first point, which is we need a government, these people need to have a seat on the table. People from the diaspora, people from Lebanon. Women is the most underrepresented asset, underestimated asset in Lebanon. So these need to have a say on any future program. And that's the first key point. The second key point is, there's plenty of things that you can do to regain confidence, but the process is going to take time. Reforms take a lot of time to lead for positive results. I mean, the first very important thing to do so that you can give the sense that you're actually serious about reforms is maybe start with the World Bank. The World Bank has an asset recovery program. This is something that could perhaps give a good sense of commitment. Obviously, today, as you know, Hadley, political leaders, they have no appetite for reform. I mean, anything that would give some hope, an asset recovery program with the World Bank, anything on corruption, a committee that is serious about corruption, publicizing public officials' assets. All these are, small steps to a much longer process of reform, and they will help build confidence, but gradually. The point is you cannot really shock the patient to prosperity in one day. Otherwise, the patient is gonna die. You gotta do it step by step, and it's gonna take a lot of years, as Ambassador Jeffrey said at the start of this.
I want to bring in Hung Tran on this as well. When you think about this a little bit more broadly, just even the first step of this building Lebanon, building a better Lebanon, we're talking about stopping that bleeding. And Ren was just saying you can't do it. You can't shock the patient while they're on the operating table. Walk us through the minimum required at this point, in your view, to get Lebanon at least stable in the short term.
Well, from the point of view of the financial sector and the collapse of the banking system, several things are needed right away. Number one, a serious audit of the central bank and the banking sector in Lebanon to really ascertain the magnitude of the losses in US dollar denominated loans and bank deposits. Lebanon has the highest ratio of US dollar denominated claims in terms of loans and deposits, almost 5 times the GDP of the country, the highest in the world. And since the US dollar inflow has been cut significantly over the past 2 years, there's no way for Lebanon to continue with that model to import US dollar to fund a necessary import and to sustain and service such a huge amount of US dollar denominated bank loans and deposits. So number one, serious audit. Number two, to realize that the losses to the banking system, both the central bank and the banking system, commercial banks, is significant and tremendous. According to the Lebanese government owns plan for rescue and reconstruction, more than 60 billion US dollar losses sustained by the central bank of Lebanon, including all the losses hidden by financial engineering maneuvers and transactions that the central bank has been put on, and more than $80 billion of losses for the commercial banks. The talk now is to really build in or to get the shareholders and the creditors and the large depositors of the banks to absorb the loss. Yes, that has to be done. But even if you build in all the shareholders and most of the wealth of the large depositors, it may not be sufficient to absorb the scale of losses that I have indicated and to provide fresh capital to recapitalize the banking system to set the basis for a recovery for the Lebanese economy. And number three, therefore, it is clear that Lebanese will need foreign assistance, fresh capital from outside the country, either from friendly countries or from the diaspora to recapitalize the banking system. And therefore, they really need to demonstrate that they are willing, happy, and able to undertake the minimum reform in the banking system to get that support. And my idea in the report is to suggest the formation of a Lebanese financial rehabilitation fund, patterned after the Greek Hellenic Financial Stability Fund, supported by friendly countries, so that it can start the process. And in this, the Lebanese government and Lebanese public should be committed to contribute to this fund, either by selling their state-owned assets or selling some of their gold.
Hung, to do anything that you've just discussed, is it possible to do any of that with Riyad Salemi still running the central bank and with Salim Safir now re-elected to be the chairman of the Association of the Banks of Lebanon?
Well, again,
with these two guys running the show, is it possible to do any of the things you're talking about?
My argument is not depending on any personalities. My argument is say that the more you delay, the more you avoid doing this necessary minimum reform, the worse the situation will become, and the worse you yourself will find yourself in. So by sheer interest and self-survival, even for those people, they will have to, at some point, accept that they need to do something to get out of this hole. Otherwise, they keep digging and the hole will get deeper, regardless of personalities.
Marissa, come in on that one, especially talking about the idea that we've got to stem the bleeding in the short term, not just for the millions of refugees, but we also are talking about over half the population, which is of course women.
Yes. Go ahead, Melissa.
Ambassador Jeffrey mentioned that the female labor participation rate has decreased. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Yes, the women factor is huge. That's where the untapped potential is. Female labor participation stands at 23%, and it's on the decline, unfortunately. And with that factor in particular, there are interventions that can be done through development donors and development programs that are already working in Lebanon through different UN agencies and other international NGOs. So increasing capacity of women, offering mentoring programs, those are all excellent interventions. They should be promoted and strengthened further. But what women are lacking is access to finance. Because even though Lebanese women own 10% of businesses, and that's a little bit higher than the regional average, with the exception of a few GCC countries, it is still very low given the potential that we have and the high education. They're highly educated women. And so access to finance is key. I would also dare ask international aid agencies to ensure that anytime they support a given program, a given development program, that they ensure that that NGO supports women, that they employ women as an equal footing to men, and that they also ensure that at least 50% of their beneficiaries are women. It might be controversial, but that's sometimes the only way you can ensure that women are being included. I think what we've seen with the pandemic effects on the workplace, with work basically being remote for everybody, that will obviously help a lot of women enter the workforce, but also start their businesses online. So those more efforts should probably go into supporting women who want to start their businesses, particularly online, and that's a huge area of a huge opportunity for Lebanese youth as well moving forward.
I just want to mention to everybody, depending on where you may be joining us from, at any time during this webcast, you can submit your questions. Either you can submit them via Twitter at Wilson Center MEP or by email mep@wilsoncenter.org. And we're going to obviously have the question and answer in just a little while from now. But I want to bring Mohsen Khan in now just to give us his reaction to this report as a whole, and in terms of what we can at least expect in the coming months as the political forces continue to pressure Lebanon. Mohsen.
Well, thank you very much. Let me start off by saying that this report is extremely timely. But let me just go step back a minute and say the Lebanese crisis that is not a surprise that it's a crisis. I think Ambassador Hale mentioned that in 1992 it was the crisis then as well. The fact of the matter is, why has it taken so long to actually erupt into this situation that we face now? I've been working on Middle East countries for a long time, and the IMF too. And quite honestly, this is the most serious crisis in my experience, that I've ever seen, right, as crisis it is in Lebanon. So there are two key things that are needed to solve this crisis when I come to the economic policies shortly. One is, of course, it's evident to everyone that the precondition is political consensus, a government that is politically in agreement that these are the issues and these are the actions they must take. Barring that, nothing's going to happen. And I think that the second big lift here is that you need a tremendous amount of financing. I mean, I think the issue really is, we can talk about billions here, billions there, etc., coming from donor countries. And I understand from the IMF, from the World Bank, etc. But if you look at UNCTAD's just the bank restructuring and bank rehabilitation needs, the amounts are huge. They're, of an order of magnitude of if you can raise 10 billion, you need 50 billion. where is that going to come from? And I see the prospects of that very limited. Now, I think that bank rehabilitation, and the reason for that is, of course, very evident, and it's been evident for a long time. You know, one way to characterize it is that in Lebanon is a big bank with a small country attached to it. The banking system is 5 times the size of, over 5 times the size of GDP of Lebanon. So if anything goes wrong in the banking system, and a Ponzi scheme was going on for so long, you know, the country is destroyed. And I think that point, the first thing I would mention is that Hang Tran makes a very good case for why this is needed to do, why the bank rehabilitation is essential. There will be costs of doing that, and the costs will be borne by a lot of people. I don't think you can just simply say that the costs will only be borne by the wealthy. That's not going to happen. Everyone is going to share in those costs. Even the people who have suffered the most would be asked to suffer some more in here. Now, in the program that Rand has outlined, I think I agree in large part with the policies that he's suggesting, that you have to do it in stages. You have to do the financial rehabilitation first. Of course you do. Then you move on to sort of other things like reforms of various kinds, changing the system, reforming the electricity company, fixing the subsidy problems. All these are absolutely essential. I think that I see the case that he's making, that the report is making, that, you know, you can't impose fiscal austerity on the Lebanese people. I agree with that. But the point is that austerity will come. It doesn't have to be fiscal. Let me just put it another way. There's monetary and financial austerity that people in Lebanon are going through now, and this will continue. So essentially, reduction in the classic thing is, you try, if demand is running over your productive potential, you have to bring demand down, or you have to raise productive potential. So here I come to what Marissa is saying, part in this. I thought this is essentially, if I may summarize, what she is saying is that you have to transform the Lebanese economy with a new economic model. And that new economic model is not the banking system any longer, because that's all Lebanon has had. The new economic model has to emphasize other sectors of the economy, whether it's agriculture or manufacturing, certainly technology. These are the sectors that future Lebanon must have. And I think that fits in nicely. And if I can just briefly summarize, you've got a crisis, you've got a Ponzi scheme that's come to an end, okay? All Ponzi schemes come to an end, and they end badly. But you've got a Ponzi scheme, it's come to an end. We're facing a disastrous situation in Lebanon. What are the steps you must take to fix it? First, you go off, try and sort out the banks, which has been the trigger for this. Sort out the banks. You then come into the structural reforms, whether it's fiscal reforms, revenue reforms, subsidy reforms, and so on and so forth. And finally, you come to building a new economic model, in a sense, making Lebanon quite different from what it has been for the last 20, 30, or even longer years.
Rand, I want you to pop in on this one, because essentially what we're saying at this point is, I mean, if you look at Lebanon as a whole, I forget if it was Ambassador Jeffrey who said this a bit earlier. He called it a magnificent experiment in cross-communal life. Others would look at Lebanon and say they were just the grasshoppers that sang all summer. And now that's all come home to roost. But in terms of creating that new economic model, the things that have to take place in order to get there, some of the things listed in the report, obviously reducing the public sector wage bill, enhancing tax progressivity, reforming obviously the electricity sector and restructuring other state-owned enterprises. That was something that in an interview I did less than 2 years ago with Saad Hariri, when he finally decided to say that we were in an economic crisis in Lebanon, though he refused to bring in the IMF. This was something he was very much focused on, and he said, which was so tempting, to take a lot of those state-owned enterprises private. Where do we go from here in that sense, Rand?
Look, I mean, the most important thing, let me take just a quick step back, because we keep hearing about this narrative that the IMF is going to be the silver bullet. Let me be clear. I mean, the IMF, and I will reiterate what I said earlier, the IMF is going to be extremely important. As Hunk has mentioned in his analysis, the IMF's technical assistance, particularly now in the short term, is going to be extremely helpful to rebuild the institutions and to start the process of a longer term reform. But any program, any plan, any stabilization plan needs to be very well tailored to the Lebanese situation. It needs to take into account, you know, the underlying institutional capacities. If you bring, Hadley, all the financial resources today and you dump them into Lebanon, we have a lot of capacity constraints. We won't be able to solve the problem. In fact, the IMF has actually failed to take into account or to take note of the unsustainability of Lebanon's dollarized economy. If you look at their most recent Article 4 report, which was published actually on the day the protests in Lebanon erupted, October 17, 2019, the IMF commended the central bank in Lebanon for maintaining financial stability. So that's why I keep saying, I mean, I'm a former IMF person. I shouldn't be probably saying this, but we need to be practical. We need to be pragmatic in how we approach this crisis. Yes, there are problems in EDL. There are problems in every single state-owned enterprise in Lebanon. There is a very inefficient tax system. You are dealing with a country that was literally robbed by a few people, Hadley. You're dealing with a country where the central bank is doing now everything that a central bank should not be doing. So the bottom line is we have to start as soon as possible. The longer we wait, the more painful it's gonna be. But you need to start step by step. Those baby steps are extremely important. And before we embark onto all these other things, let's just start rehabilitating the financial sector. Without a financial sector, you cannot grow an economy. You cannot really have a real economic growth if the banks aren't really capitalized, if they're not doing the right job.
Part of that has to be, as you guys say in the report, educating the populace about not just political reforms, if you will, but understanding financial reforms as well, because I think we can all agree that Lebanon would not be in the situation that it's in, despite all of the corruption, if people actually understood something about getting a return on their dollar and what is something that one can reasonably expect in a world awash with cash. When you're getting some kind of return that's just not feasible in any other part of the world, but you're getting it from a Lebanese bank, the idea that people were educated enough to understand that there might be a problem would have been helpful. I wanted to just bring Hung Tran in again on this one, and just in terms of what happens next with cultivating that kind of competency. It seems as if one has a heck of a long way to go in terms of getting there. What would be the first thing that needs to take place in your view prior to elections? Because as Ambassador Hale did say, I mean, you can't have financial competency without political competency, but what can be done in the short term?
Well, two comments. One is to reiterate the point that we talk about bank restructuring as if it is something technical that can happen aloof from the day-to-day life of the people. No, the opposite is true. If you restructure the banking system in Lebanon, that will inflict huge losses in savings and wealth of most of the population in the country. Not only the shareholders of the banks or the large depositor of the banks, but everyone. And basically, such loss of wealth will depress economic activities for years to come. That will make any recovery even more difficult to achieve, but there's no way to escape that. So be aware that bank restructuring is a very painful and very negative experience for the economy, number one. Number two, what I suggest is to form this Lebanese Financial Rehabilitation Fund. And the fund should be organized, managed, and structured by international donor countries under their supervision through a board of supervisors. And the staff should be recruited based on merits and capabilities. And as we have said, there's a large diaspora of Lebanese overseas. Many of them are financial experts or banking experts. They can be recruited and staff this fund. And the fund will have the task of really overhauling the whole banking system in the country, auditing the banks, including the central banks, resolve the banks, merge with banks to reduce the number of banks registered with the central bank, around 142 banks down to, let's say, 10 or 12 viable banks. And they will have to do all of that and inject money either through equity or loans to serve as a catalyst for other potential investors inside and outside of the country, including in the diaspora, to come in and recapitalize the banking system. And that is the very minimum that they can do so that they can begin to get a banking system or banking entities that can support economic activities.
Marissa, before we open it up to questions, I want to follow on to what Hong Tong was saying there, because we were essentially saying that any bank restructuring is going to be incredibly painful, fiscally painful. It's also going to be financially painful. And we've already seen a huge amount of young people. Anyone who can emigrate is getting out of Lebanon if they can at this point, which means that you're going to have a serious brain drain and skills gap. What do you think is the greatest challenge there in trying to maintain some kind of livable country, if you will, while at the same time implementing the reforms that Lebanon has to implement in order to continue as a viable state?
Hadley, you mentioned a very important concern regarding the brain drain that Lebanon is suffering. It came to other countries in the region, but more so in Lebanon. I think, again, going back to the term that Rand used earlier, let's look at the low-hanging fruit, and particularly when it comes to young people. As you mentioned, we've consulted during our workshops with different members of the Lebanese private sector, civil society, etc., to enrich our report with their ideas. And it was striking to me that there were some business leaders who said, well, we do have jobs, but we're unable to find skilled labor for these jobs. And that's where the importance of skilling, upskilling, or reskilling comes into place. These three terms are the hot topic of the future of work regionally and globally. And when it comes to Lebanon, there are tremendous opportunities there where the development agencies that already work there can strengthen some of these programs further, particularly in the tech sector. Mohsen mentioned sort of a realignment of the sectors, reassessing what these sectors that Lebanon needs in the future. We'll probably have to begin with looking at how technology is part of it. If we've learned anything during this pandemic, is that technology is intrinsically linked to the workplace. And so investing in skilling, particularly digital skills, investing in skills that the market needs, and that requires, of course, ongoing dialogue between the private sector, civil society, as well as higher education. And we go back again to sort of how to bring people back to trust, which you asked the question earlier to Rand regarding the diaspora. And I think the key word here is engaging in dialogue and consultation. And that's one way you can bring people back in. Lebanon has historically enjoyed a very vibrant private sector. Yes, the vast majority are micro, small, and medium enterprises, but they do have the experience, they do have the local knowledge, and they do have the local connections. They also have relational connections to the diaspora, not transactional ones. And this is how you bring people back in. This is how you engage the diaspora to invest not only in funding or in capital, but also through knowledge transfers and expertise. We've seen how the Lebanese diaspora was so successful in coming together and pouring funds back into Lebanon to help their families and friends after the Beirut port explosion. This is an important experience that we should learn from and capitalize on the networks that have already been formed in this regard. So that's where I think the low-hanging fruit is. It's to already work on existing programs, strengthen them, bring in more funding. And in the report, one of the recommendations or suggestions that we bring forward is basically a Lebanon Incubator investment fund that, again, could be funded by donor countries, including the US and France and Germany, other EU countries as well, but also regional partners and allies of the Lebanese people. And of course, the diaspora, once again, they are key to unlocking the potential of people in Lebanon, and particularly with regards to youth, women, and other marginalized groups.
I love that point about the Incubator Investment Fund. It's something that we've spoken so often to on and off the record with folks in the Lebanese diaspora, as you mentioned, who have lost trust, obviously, in the state and the state apparatus, but are very, very willing to help when approached the right way and feeling as if they actually have a voice and a say in how their money and expertise is put to work. But I want to get to our questions now. I want to go first to our expert workshop participants. Firas Maqsad has a question. If you could just unmute Firas, take it away.
Hadley, good to be with you this morning. Good to be with many friends and colleagues, particularly those at the Wilson Center. I think there's a general consensus from the speakers this morning that all things have to begin with the formation of a capable government that can engage with the IMF and other international donors. Of course, the crux of the matter here is how do you get to unlocking the politics of a place like Lebanon that is not just a country whose people are striving for independence and sovereignty, but the fact that Lebanon also happens to be an arena for regional and international competition. So my question here is primarily directed to Ambassador Hale, but also anybody from the panel that would like to chime in. We know that Lebanon, it needed rebooting after the war of 15 years that ended in 1990, and that came in the form of a regional and international understanding named the Taif Accords. It needed another reboot in 2008 with the Doha Accords. Are we in a place today where Lebanon needs that kind of regional and international involvement? Obviously, a lot of us, Marissa mentioned the diaspora, a lot of us in the diaspora are pinning our hopes first and foremost on the Lebanese people, civil society, those who are taking to the street on a daily basis. That continues to be so. But the dose of realism also stipulates that we need to look at the regional environment in which Lebanon exists today. So my question really is, and I agree with Ambassador Hale that the talks today in Vienna are squarely focused on the nuclear, but the Biden administration has made it clear that they hope to engage to have follow-on talks with the Iranians about other issues, including ballistic missiles and the regional situation. Does Lebanon today need that kind of regional understanding, whether we like it or hate it, that would have to include the Iranians, the way that the Taif Accords require the participation of the Assad regime? And if that is the case, how up on the priority list is Lebanon for the Biden administration? Thank you.
Ambassador, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I agree that the regional dimension is so influential on developments in Lebanon, partly because the Lebanese factions themselves draw or think they draw strength from their alliances with different actors in the region or even the United States. In my comments at the beginning, I tried to dispel any conception that there would be some grand deal politically that will be a foundation for the necessary stability for Lebanon and economic reforms. I don't see it in the cards. I could be wrong, but I don't see any parties willing to step in to that degree to really sort things out. So that's why I said, don't wait. The Lebanese should not expect external salvation at the political level. I do not believe that U.S.-Iranian relations will create an environment in which the Iranians will feel that they can somehow ease up in their pressure and using Hezbollah as a pressure point in the region and on Israel. That's not going to change. And until that changes, we're not going to be doing any favors for the Iranians either, to the contrary. So I would not put my hopes in that direction. I would work now on what is needed to form a government that's good enough and has the capacity to undertake these reforms. And then you'll have the international financial support. And I agree with the different comments about the limitations to that, but that's a necessary ingredient to getting started. Over to you.
Just to follow on to that quickly, Ambassador Hale, when we talk about the potential for a dual track there to the JCPOA conversations happening in Vienna, to your knowledge and your work, that is not happening in tandem.
No. pretty certain that's the case. There is a recognition that the regional issues are going to have to be addressed, but I don't believe that's been raised directly with the Iranians. We are going to have to see a strategy, though, that supports our friends and allies against Iranian pressure. Back to you.
I want to bring in our next question. This one is also from our expert workshop participants, Dr. Joseph Jabili.
Yes, hello. This is a question for also Ambassador Hale. Hi, David. So while it's understandable that the U.S., France, and other friends of Lebanon are still pressuring the current decision makers in the country to do the proper reforms and to implement what's been demanded by the people and the international community. But how can you expect from those who ruined the country, the so-called now mafia militia clique, to fix those problems, the problem they created, at the same time when they lost the confidence of the people, the diaspora, and even quite honestly, many also official abroad? And shouldn't we be more focused on instigating the change, focusing on elections on time, but maybe as soon as possible, engaging, empowering those who want the change, whether established opposition party or new groups? That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Great to hear from you. Yes, there's much truth in what you say. It's not in my power, or I believe anyone single person or government's power, to bring about the kind of sweeping political change that you're describing. I think we have to understand that there's ingredients that we have to work with, whether we like it or not. As some speakers said, the reforms are needed now. Economic reforms are needed now. So the sooner we can get a government reform that can at least begin to address these things, even if it's imperfect, I think will be a better outcome than the deterioration that we're experiencing now. I would say that while I share your negative assessment of many of the factional leaders, there are others who are prepared and understand the urgency of the problem and the nature of the problem. So we need to support them as well. I would, on the topic of elections, we certainly are very concerned about them. This is a focus in Lebanon during my conversations there. In fact, partly it's an impediment to getting moving on some of the key decisions that need to be made as people sort of maneuver over that. The United States position's been firm and will be firm. Those elections need to occur on time and be free and fair. And we'll see if the people are allowed to express their will, what changes that will bring.
Ambassador Hale, you're not speaking for the U.S. government anymore. Can you give us a hint on some of the people that you think are part of the government or should be part of the government?
No, I mean, I know from my time in Lebanon that anything someone like me says about personalities or predictions will be a problem. So no, I don't want to go in that direction.
Our next question from the workshop participants, Dilip Rata. If you want to unmute.
Thank you. There are three, I'm not able to start my video, but anyways, there are three channels for mobilizing diaspora resources for Lebanon. One, you have talked about skills. There are two others, remittances and diaspora investments. On remittances, very easy to pinpoint that sending money from Australia to Lebanon costs about 12% in fees. And sending money from UK to Lebanon also on average costs more than 10%, according to remittance prices worldwide database of the World Bank. That's a low-hanging fruit. Remittances were about 33% of GDP in Lebanon. So that's an obvious point. And on diaspora investments, mobilizing diaspora investments, a potent tool to be explored, that could be explored, is diaspora bonds, where you sell the government or a reputed private company in Lebanon issues a retail diaspora bond in denominations of $1,000 or $2,000 and markets it abroad, properly registered in the proper SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. That I wanted to leave you with that as a financing tool that could actually mobilize billions of dollars per year potentially for Lebanon for all kinds of projects and programs. Thank you.
Hadley, mind if I jump in quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dilip, thanks for your comments. We do actually very briefly discuss diaspora bonds in the report as a tool to also engage the diaspora, but you are the expert on this, so thank you for your comments.
Our next question is coming from Samir Saleme. Samir?
Yes, thank you, Hadley. So good morning, everyone. Ambassador Hale said when he was here a few months ago, he was surprised how grim the situation is or was. I would say now, 60 days later, those days will look back as being literally giddy. Things have gotten far, far worse in the last 60 days than they were 60 days ago. And as we sit around and talk, Rome is burning, or in this case, Lebanon is. And the only one that's going to win out of this thing is the only organization in Lebanon that has the organization and the wherewithal to stand firm, and we know who that is. So all that's going to lead us to a failed state very quickly, and that's not good for our neighbors to the south or to anybody in Lebanon. And everybody who can get out of Dodge, so to speak, is getting out. And when we will look back at this a few years from now, I think this immigration that's happening now, this brain drain that's happening, is probably the worst that's going to have the worst effect on this country. The financial situation is bad, as we know, but fixing Lebanon, speaking as a businessman, is not that complicated. This is a very small country. We don't need that much money in the scheme of things. So money we can get, financing we can get one way or another. The situation is, how can we get the people against the current situation, the people who went down to the street on 17 October 2019, to unite. The issue here right now is nobody knows what is required to get this government that everybody's looking for. And my question, I guess, is to Rand, is what can the international community here do to help guide us? We were talking about Riyad Salemi earlier, no relation to me, by the way, just to be clear. Most people in Lebanon still think he's in place because the US government wants him to be in place because they support him. Nobody understands the situation. Nobody understands what does the international community want so that we can unite behind it. And when we go into the elections, hopefully we have elections next year, we actually have a chance to put in a few people in parliament, because as we are right now, we're going to fail again because we're not united. So what can the international community do to help us unite and prepare for the elections next year? And what can we do in the meantime as literally the country is disintegrating around us? Thank you.
Ambassador Hale, do you want to jump in there? Because it kind of follows on to what I was asking you earlier about the fact that most Lebanese see the US meeting with someone like a Riyad Salemi as an endorsement of him and his policies.
Sure, although I thought the question was directed at Rand, but it's not the United States' place to comment on the qualifications of different Lebanese officials. This is from the Lebanese system to work out. All I said was that it is a common practice of American diplomats, particularly in a place as complicated as Lebanon, to have contacts with everybody. And Riyad Salami is in a key position in influencing a resolution of this problem. So I think it would be not particularly effective to neglect that relationship. But it's up to the Lebanese on what they're going to do in terms of these positions and so forth. But maybe Rand wanted to talk about it as well.
Yeah, let me
Rand, how do we get there?
Let me just say a few things. I want to first echo what Ambassador Hale just said. I mean, there is no tool, there is no event, there is no financial engineering or any change in regional powers that would help Lebanon if the Lebanese do not help themselves. That's number one. I mean, before we talk about the international community, they need to unite and they need to decide on how they want to move forward in the next couple of years. Two things I would say about the international community. There is today a loan from the World Bank, I think $280 million, which is supposedly going to be dispersed to help the most vulnerable groups in society. I think the World Bank needs to do way more than that. Let's not forget, Hadley, that in 2011, I mean, starting 2011, Lebanon welcomed and integrated more than million refugees from Syria. And I think this is in the words of the World Bank director from a couple of days ago. I mean, I don't think the world has responded back to this generosity in the right way. And there needs to be much more that the World Bank and other institutions that they need to do. There is an idea, and I know you've been talking about it, Hadley, for a couple of days now, which is, using sanctions as a pressure point. I personally think there is a big question mark on how effective sanctions could be. I mean, we have a natural experiment today in Lebanon. One of the former ministers has been sanctioned, Jubran Basil, and I cannot really see, besides the personal, the impact on the person himself, I do not really see much impact on the population. How would this help the population? I think we need to go beyond just sanctions on these corrupt people. We need to figure out a more comprehensive Marshall Plan to help the population in a way, because we're talking about at least now 50% of the population are in poverty.
Marissa, if you want to pop in on that one as well, because when we talk about sanctions, I believe the ones that you're referring to around Jubran Basil especially was just quoted as saying in one of the Lebanese publications, he was just quoted as saying that he hasn't been approached by the US government and hasn't been told what exactly he's been sanctioned for, and those sanctions haven't begun to bite in any real way, but that's up for debate. But in terms of creating that trust and creating a situation where there would be a government that would not only be viable, but one that the international community and NGOs and the IMF and the World Bank could actually trust to work with, how do we get there?
That's the million-dollar question, but it's hard to answer it fully. But I think it starts with ensuring that any dialogue should include members of civil society, of the private sector, and those activists who are also protesting, demanding change. Without that consultative process, and that perhaps is one way. You mentioned earlier what we talk about in the report in terms of educating the people about the financial and economic reforms that we're prescribing in the report. That's one way to educate the people as well on what that entails and how they will be affected by it. And that's also one way to ensure that you have new emerging leaders in Lebanon. It takes a lot of engagement. We've already talked about investing through skilling, and I want to go back to the skills, because one of the sort of major items on the agenda in any skilling discussion is the need for what they're referred to as soft skills. I like to call them essential skills, and those have to do with communication, negotiation, how to work together in a team, how to build a team, critical thinking, leadership. Those are important skills that are definitely missing and are in need, in demand, not only in Lebanon, but regionally and globally as well. And this is how you plant the seeds. Yes, it's a long-term process, but you have to start somewhere. And again, the donor community, international organizations who are already working in that space, they are not solely working with the Lebanese people, but also working with refugee populations. This is how you you focus on those sort of medium to long-term solutions. There's no quick fix to this.
I want to take one more question from the expert workshop. It's Rima Fraji. Rima?
Hello, so I come from the agri-food sector, and we've been meeting quite regularly as a private sector network, trying to work on two key issues. One is to lobby, and we need help in that, actually, even in financing the lobbying that we're planning to do, to allocate responsibility back to where responsibility should be. We believe there's been a deliberate attempt at reducing confidence with the private sector. And the other aspect is, how can we bridge between the existing businesses that have the capacity to grow and accelerate the growth of these incubators or any other work that you're doing as NGOs or international organizations without access to financing. So there's a lot of businesses here that are still viable, that can still contribute to the economy and can accelerate this growth. And we would like to see how can we bridge our work with the work that you're doing.
Rand, would you like to take that one?
I want to go back to the point that Marissa and Dr. Dilip Ratha brought up, which is, I think, fits very nicely in this particular field, which is the diaspora bonds. The idea of a diaspora bond is to involve the Lebanese abroad in basically projects in Lebanon, and mainly projects that appeal to them. So I know a lot of the Lebanese in the US, in Europe, all over the place, in the Middle East, are very interested in helping. They just don't want to go through government institutions. And the government, the diaspora bond, or what people refer to sometimes as a patriotic bond, is a way to channel the money rather than actually getting it through the banking sector and being spent on unproductive resources. It's a way to channel the money to these projects that are really important and appealing for us outside: healthcare, agriculture, development. And you know, without really getting into the technicalities of it, it's a win-win scenario. I mean, on one side, it would be structured in a way that would provide the Lebanese abroad with a much higher return on how much they would get if they leave their money in a US bank account, for example. At the same way, it would provide the Lebanese in Lebanon, the private sector and institutions in general, with a cheaper way to basically source financing. It would be much more cheaper. It would be structured in a way that would make it much more cheaper to raise funds rather than going on the international markets. I think the diaspora bond is an excellent idea. It's been implemented in many different countries in the region as well, and it was very successful in raising a lot of funds. I think we should take this seriously, and we've been talking about it for quite some time now.
Hadley, can I add a comment here?
Yes, yes, please.
Yes, I just want to bring to your attention that the revitalized and viable banking system is a very important source of financing for small and medium-sized enterprises. And that is the case for every other countries, even in the US. So I think that restructuring the banks can serve the purpose of making financing available to more participants in Lebanon.
I want to take it now to the first question from the actual audience, beyond our workshop of participants. This question concerns the energy sector. It's one of those big ones that we talk about on CNBC on a regular basis. Essentially this question, the electricity sector is at the heart of the economic and fiscal crisis, accountable for about 40% of the public debt. Lebanon has been suffering from a chronic electricity shortage for almost 3 decades. The question, shouldn't reforming the energy sector be the priority to recover the country? And what should be the key factors in reforming that sector? Rand or Hung, which one would you like to take a stab at this one first, if you would?
Let me say in less than a minute, it's a priority, but it's not the immediate priority, just because you don't want to overwhelm the institutions and the country. It's a country that is flat on its back right now. And there's so many things that are considered priorities. I mean, the tax system is a priority. The banking sector is a priority. Every state institution, the customs, controlling the border is a priority. A new monetary policy regime is a priority. But I think, in my view, and I think Hung would agree, and that's his expertise, the most urgent thing right now is to get the banking sector, and then we can embark onto EDL and other things. Absolutely, there's a huge drain on the budget that came from EDL. I think the World Bank estimated it in around like $43 billion. It is an important reform, but I would say let's wait until we first deal with the bleeding. Hung, do you want to address this as well? Sorry.
No, I agree with you completely. Thank you.
And then our second audience question concerns the justice system. The justice system in Lebanon is on paper that of a republic, but in practice, selective enforcement happens across all judicial rulings. Can Lebanon realistically achieve economic stability without a credible and accountable judicial system? On a limb and say the answer to that one's probably no, but take a stab at this one in terms of the judicial accountability at this point. Rand.
Okay. Say this is part of And I think also for the community, we are in need of, but we are like to improve how we actually manage institutions. We need this, the judiciary sector and other sector, but definitely this is something that would need to be in place. Rule of independent, important. Otherwise, we cannot really create an environment, a good business environment for the private sector to operate efficiently, or to start, believing again in the institutions.
A little earlier today with the Lebanese parliament approving this 1 year 556 million ration card. This was for 500,000 families. That essentially amounts to $3. There are a lot of things to be understood about this in terms of criteria moving forward. But stopgap measures like this one obviously are just not to stem the bleeding. And as the panelists have said multiple times, to fix the situation in Lebanon, it's going to hurt, and it's going to. I want to get the final thoughts from each of the panelists on this one, just in terms of what happens next, the short term, and then we'll Ambassador Hale in terms of what could potentially be expected in his view from the international community and what has to be done, at least in the short term, to get us there.
I think basically in the stages laid out in the report, I agree with them, and I think and see what you. I'm not sure that you can do all that the report is saying, but start. I'll just say one other thing in closing, to avoid getting carried away. Diaspora bonds are in principle a good thing, but diaspora bonds are very much like Eurobonds, because basically they are a government of Lebanon, and therefore they're like Eurobonds. So I don't see the market for diaspora, whether it ran like you call them patriotic bonds, etc. Diaspora bonds have been used by countries that are stable, need resources. It's not countries that have been basically over borrowing in Eurobonds and then come along and you call it by. I'll end there.
Marissa.
Thanks, Hadley. I think I'd leave everyone with this thought, summarizing sort of the economic Mohsen described about my chapter. So a key element of this economic transformation that we all hope for and hope to see in the country's workforce formula. So on the supply side, emphasizing skills, particularly marginalized, but also on the demand side, access to finance and facilitating access to markets. And one way we can do that, shop for SMEs, and sort of work through existing frameworks that exist. And I'm going to leave you with one example. The FTA with the EU came up, and this is an opportunity for some of the EU countries to come in and perhaps train and build sector to enable small and medium businesses to grow their businesses and access markets in Europe. Thank you.
Hung?
Well, time is of the essence. The longer this crisis lingers on, the worse it will become. And the worse the suffering of the people in Lebanon, humanitarian crisis, but also for neighboring countries and the international community if Lebanon becomes a failed state, spewing out refugees and terrorists, destabilizing the whole situation. So I think that I hope this situation will, and this logic will eventually crystallize and focus the minds of the people So that's a minimal agreement to reform will come forth.
Rand.
My last point is just to remind the international community that Lebanon is extremely fragile. It's extremely unstable at the moment, and it requires a very pragmatic, customized, and patient approach. Despite all the weaknesses that we talked about today, and despite what we brought up in the report, let's not forget, in Lebanon and in the diaspora, there is an enormous amount of human capital. There is a lot of potential, and it's not the end of the road. This is, of course, not Argentina. This is not Greek. This is not even Venezuela. It's a very unprecedented crisis, but the Lebanese can do it, and I'm sure they will if they come together. The first step, let me end it with this very first step, is we need to create a government. There's nothing we can do. There's nothing we cannot talk to the international community if we don't have a government. And this needs to be a very credible government of reform. Thank you.
Ambassador Hale, I just want to get your final thoughts on this one, obviously from the wealth of your experience, and we deeply appreciate your participation in this. And I bring it back to this quote, the magnificent experiment in cross-communal life that cannot be allowed to fail. It cannot be allowed to fail for the region. It can't be allowed to fail for Western powers, and certainly it cannot be allowed to fail by the United States. Ambassador Hale, your thoughts?
I completely agree. The United States does not want Lebanon to collapse further than it has already, but no external power can impose a political compromise on the parties inside Lebanon. And we can urge and cajole, but they have to make the decisions necessary. That's what I've said to them on 3 consecutive visits to Lebanon in the last year and a half. There's no absence of great ideas on what needs to be done in the economy and on reform. We heard many of them today. I agree about customizing things, but what's absent is the necessary political flexibility and will. The Lebanese have to take the first steps. They have to form a government, and then the international community will help. The path to recovery will be very long and very painful. But I too have faith in the Lebanese people. You look around the world and you see countless success stories, and those successes can occur in Lebanon again with the right kind of leadership. Thank you, Hadley.
Thank you, all of you. Once again, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining us. And hopefully this is not the end of this conversation, but actually the beginning of a much bigger conversation. I want to say thank you all very much again, and thank you on the part of CNBC as well.